Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the regular Friday meeting of the City Club of Portland. My name is Bill Lesh, and I'm your president. I'd like to take a minute at the outset here to welcome several new members, ask them to stand, and ask you to hold your applause until everyone has been introduced. First, we have Kathy Glennon, Development Director for Planned Parenthood. Next, we have Peggy Groundwater of Counsel with Perkins Coie. I think that means she's a lawyer. Ann Jackson, Marketing Assistant for KWJJ Radio. Alan Routh, Publisher and CEO of Pacific Gateway Publications. Richard Yarnell, Managing Director of Storefront Theater. And John Wish, CEO and owner of Marketing Focus. Welcome to the City Club of Portland. I'd like to thank Alan Abrahamel and myself for recruiting those new members. Actually, it says Bill Lesh on the script, but that sounds a little pretentious. I'd like to welcome those of you that are guests today and urge you to consider membership in the City Club. I have found in the 15 years that I have been participating that this is one of the most exciting organizations and gives me a genuine opportunity to participate in the halls of places that I would not normally probably even be allowed, let alone to go in and ask personal and pertinent questions. I hope that you will consider membership, and you will find membership materials either on your table or on the table where you came in. I'd also like to welcome the members of the Salem City Club Board who are here today. We try and exchange with Salem from time to time ideas and how it works. If they would stand, I'd like to have everyone give them a round of applause in the center of the room. Next Friday, our program will feature Dwight Sangre, who is president of the Oregon Graduate Center. He will discuss Oregon's trade deficit in high-tech workers, noting that our region is the largest net importer of technically educated workers in the nation. And as somebody who has spent some time working with clients in the high-tech area, I can tell you that this is a very hot topic with high-tech people, and it's one of the competitive issues that faces Oregon and particularly Washington, Clackamas, and Multnomah counties whenever you're trying to recruit a high-tech company. So I hope that you will join us at that meeting on October 20th here at the Mayfair Room of the Westin Benson. 2 weeks from today, we have a fascinating program that may be a little difficult for those of you in the radio audience. We are going to have a filmmaker speak on the topic of the filmmaker as Northwest artist. Gus Van Zandt will appear on the day his latest feature film, Drugstore Cowboy, premieres in the Northwest. The film was made in Portland and is open to outstanding reviews by the national media. We hope that he can overcome that and also gets great money. Never know how those reviews work. We're going to show film clips, which was my reference to the difficulty for those of you on the phone, on the radio audience, and another of that film and another by Van Zandt, which will be shown as part of the program. This will be at the Portland Hilton Hotel, so please note that in 2 weeks we will move our location. We had a membership information report go out on an issue that is on the ballot that you should have received in the mail, and I expect that all City Club members, of course, are registered voters. For those of you in the city of the Portland, we did an information report on the pension issue. We did a major study of this issue last spring, and those of you that are interested in copies of that report, there are some on your way out, and I would urge you to read them. That was a very well done report, and I think that it will help you in making up your mind as to how to vote on that particular issue. I'd also like to welcome the University Club to the 20th century. You may not all be aware that 17 years ago, the City Club joined the 20th century and added women to their membership. And I might say that women now make up almost half of the City Club's membership, and I hope that the same will happen at the University Club. Our board host today is James Harris, who is a member of the Board of Governors, a former Beaverton School Board member, and Assistant Vice President at First Interstate Bank. James has the privilege of asking the first question. And I know that some of you get bored with the question procedure, but since we do have new folks at each one of these meetings, I must remind you that questions are the privilege of City Club members only. We will have an opportunity for both written and oral questions. We give preference to those of you that have the nerve to stand up and ask a question at the microphone, which will be in the center of the room after our speaker is finished. For those of you that are shy, please use the form that's on your table for writing your question and hold it up. The staff will bring it forward. I must remind everyone again that a question ends in a question mark. There is also a blue program survey on your table, and I would urge you to fill that out. It helps us and the program committee very much in deciding on new programs and what we can do to make the City Club more exciting and interesting for you. And speaking of exciting and interesting, they say there are only two things that are certain in life: death and taxes. And I'd like to add one more, and that is, I think we can safely add controversy over our educational system as something that seems to be a certain part of this life. Debates rage over whether the educational system is failing. We ask questions such as, why is the dropout rate so high? Why are foreign students doing better in any particular subject, depending on what the article is? And how do you finance the educational system that we have today, or the system that we'd like to have? And then again, how does Portland and its schools stack up to those kinds of questions? And where are we in the debate? Our speaker today will give us his answers to that question and also some thoughts on the future and the goals that he has. Most of you, I think, know Dr. Matthew Prophet. I was fascinated by reading his long resume. I've always wanted to have a long resume, but I've never done enough in this life to work one out. You would be very impressed at the man that you have as your superintendent of Portland Public Schools. He's had that position since 1982 and has held similar positions elsewhere, obviously as a success. Now, nobody calls me from New York or Chicago to say, hey, Bill, why don't you come out and be president of the City Club here? But we have a superintendent of public instruction, or of Portland Public Schools, who is very sought after. And I think that's a measure of Portland's success and the luck that we've had in attracting somebody of the quality of a Dr. Matthew Prophet. He has, I think, given much in the time that he's been with us. He's worked together with teachers, with parents, and with the community to make the Portland Public Schools a better system of education. Will you help me today welcome Dr. Matthew Prophet, Superintendent of Schools.
Thank you, Mr. Lesh, for a very, very fine introduction. I hope the comments I make today prove to be worthy of the confidence that you've expressed in the work I'm attempting to do in Portland. I want to thank the City Club for inviting me. It's been some time since I've had the opportunity to appear. I recognize this august group of persons who are representative of the citizens of Oregon as being very definitely on the cutting edge of looking at so many of the critical issues that affect society in America today. I want to interpose kind of an apology by virtue of my voice, in that last week I was in Calgary, Canada, and unfortunately exposed to all kinds of unpredictable vicissitudes of climatological changes that have caused me to lose my voice. But because one other time I was unable to appear, I said that irrespective of what comes about today, I shall be here. I shall not again attempt to defer meeting our citizens and trying to describe to you as best I can some views that are very, very important to all of us in the city. I want to call the attention to the presence of our board members who are here today. At this table, I'd like them all to stand and be recognized as one of our board members. Mrs. Carol Turner, would you please stand? Also, Mr. Steve Kafuri, member of our Board of Education. And our most recent addition to the Portland Board of Education, Mr. Marty Howard. Please stand. Thank you. I prepared some comments, and I'm going to do my very, very best to fit these comments within the time frame that has been prescribed, knowing, of course, that there will predictably be a number of questions that those of you in the audience may want to pose that's on your mind. I'll do my very, very best to give you all the knowledge that we've got in the schools that helps to address your questions and your concerns. These are my remarks, and I hope that they're taken with the seriousness that I prepared them last night and this morning, which is what I normally do. We meet against the backdrop of an unprecedented era in American education. It's a time of crisis. It's a time of criticism. It's a time of confusion and conflict about the goals, the purposes, the direction, and the effectiveness of American public education. The American educational system has long been the envy of the world, and it still is. And its mission as the key institution in this republic is far from over. For the mission of public education, as I see it, is as vital today as it was on the frontier and throughout the development of this nation into the world power that we've become and that we are today. And I believe it will remain so in the emerging information and the highly technologically oriented society of tomorrow. I also believe that the progress of American society from a pioneer outpost to what is now a unified industrial giant and now to an information-based economy was not an accident of time, nor was an accident of circumstance. For public education is, in fact, the common denominator that can be traced from the beginning of our national history as the basic thread of our national society, and I believe that the dream many of us as Americans continue to hold for public education should not be dimmed by its critics. Because for me, the dream is still bright. Because for me and many thousands of others, the dream is still full of promise, and it still holds the same hope, the same expectations for the future that has been contributed by our ancestors who founded this outstanding nation of the world. In fact, most of us in this room today are products of what the American educational system has produced, and we owe to that system what we are, what we hope yet to still become as individuals, as a city, as a state, and as a nation. And throughout the evolution of our educational system, it has been called upon to meet the ever-changing needs of American society. There have been recurring times in the history of the public schools that have come to be recognized as great watershed periods in terms of its ability to continue to exist as one of the basic institutions of our society. And I believe that now, in 1989, and for the decade that will follow, and certainly into the 21st century, this is one of those very critically important watershed periods. I believe further that education at all levels has failed to communicate to the public the dramatic story of our accomplishments during various times when great social and economic changes have occurred in our country. But I also believe it is not so much that public education has failed to do what it ought to have done, but rather that it has simply failed to communicate what it in fact has accomplished. Let me cite a few items that support my contention of the greatness of American public education. Number one, more than 90% of today's adult population attended public schools. What this means is that the United States' prominence in fields such as space technology, science, medicine, electronics, worldwide communications, and even athletics is due in large measure to the work and achievements of public school graduates. Number two, the United States produced the first astronauts to set foot on the moon, and 23 of the first 25 astronauts assigned to lunar missions were public school graduates. Number three, the United States public school system is one of the few major educational systems in the world that is attempting to provide a free, universal public education for all who want it. In many other countries that I'm sure you're very familiar with, education beyond basic required years of schooling is available only to select segments of that particular school-age population in those respective countries. And number four, I contend, and I hope you agree, that education is, in fact, a good use for the tax dollar, and it is a good use because of some of these following facts. Although schools of another generation taught little more than the 3 R's, schools today are asked to do the following things. Schools today are asked to feed hungry students. Schools today are asked to check the hearing and the vision and the teeth of their children. They're asked to instruct them in hygiene and nutrition. They're asked to integrate neighborhoods which sometimes don't really want to be integrated. They're asked to provide recreation. They're asked to teach safe driving habits. They're asked to make a convincing argument against the abuse of drugs. They're asked to assure that kindergartners have all their childhood medical shots. They're asked to integrate our society in addition to our schools. They're asked to counsel the upset, encourage the listless, search for the absent, provide for the disinterested, motivate the lackadaisical, challenge the gifted, assure redress of grievance to the disenfranchised, care for the abused, reassure the lonely, and on and on and on. We must do all of these things in public education while still making sure that the students who are reasonably well prepared get a full, comprehensive, outstanding education. I sometimes receive letters from the patrons of Portland wanting to know why can't things be the way they were when they were back in school 40 or 50 years ago. They say to me, let's get back to reading, let's get back to writing and arithmetic and basic science. Well, first of all, I don't believe things were ever the way some of us of the older generation remember them to have been. For as a matter of fact, most of all of this century, schools have offered more than just the basics, and schools have done so because basics require more than introductory courses in a few core subjects. They require advanced classes in every area. Reading, for example, becomes English literature. It becomes a study of the classics. It becomes comparative literature. It becomes writing. It becomes theme development, expository essays, composition and structure. Mathematics becomes algebra, trigonometry, and advanced calculus. Science becomes biology, physics, geology, and anatomy. And secondly, these patrons have apparently not reflected seriously on what has occurred over the course of the last 50 years to include such prominent events such as World War II, Korea, Vietnam, United States involvement in Central America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, world communism, coexistence, détente, perestroika, assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Medgar Evers, and Martin Luther King Jr., Watergate, Iran-gate, brownouts, acid rain, high-tech, television, computers, microcomputers, lasers, supersonic jets, Japanese imports, atomic weapons, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Bloods, Crips, Asian gangs, Aryan youth, and the list of perpetual critical issues and events go on and on and on interminably in this very, very complex society in our country. I believe we would all agree that at least during the last 4 decades, public education has been to provide equal access to all students regardless of race, economic level, handicap or ability, and as increased levels of universal access that these have been accomplished. The focus has changed to equal outcomes more recently, meaning that now, in addition to access, which was really introduced as a concept by virtue of Brown versus Board of Topeka 1954, now in terms of going beyond access, we're now saying, why can't there be, and we must have, equal outcomes of kids in addition to their access to these particular programs. At the same time, however, our society as a whole has very definitely changed in a most significant way. Consequently, schools today face a very challenging new set of barriers and issues. And one such challenge is the challenging demography of our society. Let me give a few examples of some important demographics that are happening in America. Number one, lower birth rates are shrinking the population of our youth. And because of this population shift, fewer and fewer advocates are representing the interests of youth, and our youth, therefore, are receiving less governmental attention. As a result, the burden of being poor has shifted to our youth. As a matter of fact, today, a child under 6 years of age is 6 times more likely to be poor than a person who's over 65 years of age. Number two, another well-known fact is that because of economic pressure, single-parent households, or the lack of knowledge of training, many parents today are not as involved as they should be or would like to be in the care and support of their children. In other words, there's definitely no question but that America has undergone a very dramatic change in the structure of the basic family unit. For example, in 1955, 60% of the households in the United States consisted of a working father, a housewife, a mother, and 2 or more school-aged children. But since 1955, and taking this particular statistical reflection into the 1980s, I am told by a very reputable demographer, who happens to be Butch Hutchinson, that by 1980, that particular kind of family unit represented only 11% of the homes, and in 1985 it was 7%. I don't now know what the percentage is in 1989, but I've been told again by Bud Hutchinson, who's a highly reputable demographer, that this percentage has very clearly continued to decline. 59% of the children that were born in 1983 will live with only one parent before they reach age 18. A single-parent household is therefore becoming, quote unquote, the normal childhood experience. Let me recite to you a few other national statistics that apply to every 100 children born today in America. 12 of these 100 children will be born out of wedlock. 40 of these children will be born to parents who divorce before the child is 18. 5 of these children will be born to parents who separate. 2 of these children will be born to parents of whom one will die before the child reaches 18. And finally, only 41% of these children will reach age 18 normally. Also, let us not underestimate the negative influences of watching television for many hours, of unsupervised activities, of drug and alcohol abuse, of teen pregnancy, of poverty and child abuse. Each of these conditions, I contend, and I'm sure you agree, significantly conditions and impacts the education of our youth. So I suppose that because of the changes in today's society, and because our basic institutional structures in our country have not been changed or restructured to absorb these new and rather radically negative societal conditions, our schools, by default, have in fact become the basic institution for meeting most of the needs of our young people. But how many reports or analysis have you read that discuss this new institutional set of responsibilities that the schools have taken upon themselves? I would say you have read very, very little in that regard. Been generally expositions and or analysis or critiques which in essence really ascribe to the schools the same kinds of basic responsibilities which society in essence regards schools as being basically responsible for, the 3 R's. But very rarely do you hear any kind of treatment of what in fact the schools contribute to our overall society and the manner in which it has accepted the responsibilities which basically belong to the other major institutions in our society. It is not, incidentally, because the schools want to accept these responsibilities, but that we have no recourse but to accept them, because if others don't do it, we know that we cannot educate a hungry child, and we cannot educate a child whose basic needs as identified through the Maslowian hierarchy have not been met in some other way. Now, I'd like to discuss what should be the real reasons, at least as perceived by our public, for schools, and what people continue to believe to be the only things that schools attempt to do. That is, to teach kids how to read, write, and compute. The Board of Education, the teachers of our district, our principals, our staff of this school district are proud of the record that we have made in improving the reading and mathematics achievements of our students. Over the past several years, we've made some significant improvements in the student retention rate for most of our students. And as I was being introduced by Mr. Lesh, he was talking about the dropout rates and the incline that's occurring. That is not the case in Portland. As a matter of fact, our dropout rates have declined rather precipitously. They are still, however, much too high, and there's much more we need to do. But we are going against the national trend when it comes to our capacity to hold kids and to keep them in schools. And we're especially proud that the greatest progress in the basic skills of the key indicators of excellence and equity have been made by our minority students. But though we're proud of that, despite these very notable gains, it's also true that the gap in achievement test scores and other indicators of academic performance between students of different geocultural groups remains one of the greatest challenges confronting American education. And this gap remains the #1 challenge to the Portland schools as well as to the rest of the country. And while we're inspired by the fact that these disparities have begun to narrow, we recognize that much hard work lies ahead in our efforts to ultimately eliminate these differences. These problems, of course, face every school district in the nation, though they are perhaps most pressing in the large urban districts that serve the most culturally diverse student populations. And incidentally, the cultural diversity that's now being recognized in urban systems is absolutely growing by leaps and bounds. This cultural diversity has been one of the hallmarks of America as a country. It's a very unique nation. Has begun to become even more complex, and it becomes even more complex each year as our own values and executive orders controlling immigration quotas and international politics to have this country continue to serve as a refuge for those who are disenfranchised everywhere, it's becoming increasingly complex. This past year and this year, for example, something that you may not know, and I only discovered very recently myself, is that students who are Pentecostals who are coming by virtue of the new policies and so forth in the Soviet Union, and we anticipate this year of having increasing numbers of Russian youngsters. There is no question but that the impact of activities that are happening in Latin America and many, many parts of Africa will continue to have that impact upon us. And so we must accommodate all of these students irrespective of where they come because of our commitment in public education to serve everybody. But what I want everyone in this room to know is that it takes a great deal of courage and a commitment and trust for a school system to even introduce the topic of differences in school performances among ethnic groups. What I also want everyone to know is that we were among the very first school systems in this country with the guts to disaggregate school performances among ethnic groups and report these results to our community without hesitation. This school because we performance data disaggregated by ethnic group is helpful in planning, in management, in resource allocation, in instruction, in counseling and evaluation at every level of the schooling enterprise. Values that are the cornerstones of education. The first of these values, and the first is that we can learn. And I say to you that while I know there are those in the community who will say that we don't believe that, I say to you they are absolutely wrong. All of us do believe it. All of us ourselves, or too many of us ourselves, have come through our upbringing to recognize that even to utter that notion, there are potentially complex problems. In other words, that is better dealing with all of these complexities that you solutions to them. These solutions, believe it or not, number three, which perhaps equally as important as first two, is that parents, students, makers all together must be vital partners working together. I ask our Public Information Department, and I'm sure you all have this, to hand out two documents, which I'm sure I'm going to cover what's in one of those documents happens to be some of the extracts from a report to the Board of Education and the community of their student population. Progress has occurred when it comes to the advances that minorities and all of us need education. I commend our Board of Education, Board of Education, who has conceptual relation to truth to planning that caused much. While this particular, I tell you that I do not agree with such an analysis, for an idea actually has no serious. The reasons are several-fold. For example, each state's portion of revenue. Parents, therefore, no longer would be motivated to maintain local tax support. After all, their child doesn't attend in the district where they live and vote. This loss of state and local revenue would force reductions in expenditures, which means reductions in programs and services. The students left behind, those not chosen by the so-called excellent schools, would have diminished and inferior programs, and the easiest to educate students end up in the best financed schools, and consequently the most difficult and challenging students would end up in the least well-financed programs. And one of the other main things that bother me about the concept of choice is, and tuition tax credits and all, is I really wonder, will the leaders of these particularly new, so-called new movements really seek to serve poor children? Will they really seek to serve minority children? Will they really be dedicated to serving the almost ineffable needs of severely handicapped children, the emotionally disturbed children, and other children who throughout the history of America have truly been our nationally disenfranchised groups? I don't profess to have the answer to this rhetorical question, but personally, I really don't believe that this is the basic thrust and the real reasons for choice initiatives. In conclusion, let me say that public schools have of necessity become complicated social institutions, and as I stated earlier, public schools are responsible for developing citizenship, for developing leadership, for community identity, for integration, for mainstreaming, for nutrition, for parenting, for discipline. Our list of current responsibilities, as I've mentioned earlier, is virtually endless, and we do not have the unrealistic luxury of dealing only with the easiest to educate children. We are doing our best to educate children. We're doing our best to educate all children, irrespective of their race, their color, their creed, their cultural heritage, and their current condition. And we know that in the Portland public schools, or any schools in this nation for that matter, that a child only needs to be alive and breathing, and we will do our best to educate him or her. I will be the first to admit that Public education, and all of education for that matter, does have some serious problems. But I do not believe that choice in the forms that I've heard the concept presented would do more than to cause a regression in public education, and even possibly a regression to the point of bringing about serious resegregation throughout America to the former conditions of separate and very unequal schools. We know that much is needed to be done, and that the state and the federal government need to increase their support for local communities in getting this job done. We know further that there is a need for more and improved and more extensive early childhood education, that there's a need for more extensive and improved preschool programs, and that extra attention to the basics in the earliest grades and strong curricular leadership in every building, effective intervention of violence and drugs in the broader community, and a fair system for encouraging and financially supporting outstanding students who want to be teachers. Finally, let me say, in as much of a sincere term as I can, that I am not an apologist for public education. I'm an advocate for it. I always will be an advocate for it. And until America, until our state, until parents and the community and all of us begin to truly fulfill our proper roles in our newly emerging challenging society, we, at least in the Portland Public Schools, will do all we can for all children in every way, whoever they may be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prophet, for a very thoughtful and yet exciting and interesting speech. As I said at the outset, we have both oral and written questions. If you have a written question, please hold it up so the staff can pick it up. And there's a microphone out there somewhere, or shortly will be. The privilege of the first question goes to our board host today, Mr. James Harris.
Dr. Prophet, Portland School District has been one of the first districts in the country to weave multicultural education into its regular curriculum of the schools. What are your thoughts on that, and where do we go from here?
Thank you. I have to reflect back a few years, even prior to my having come to Portland, when you began to treat the topic of multicultural education. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. And I reflect back on the time when I was a superintendent of schools in Lansing, Michigan, during a period when not only were minorities seeking an opportunity to be more equitably and factually represented in the textbooks of our country, but women as well, by virtue of Title IX, were seeking the same opportunities at that time. I also remember that we put together a task force of people comprised of several textbook publishers, also composed of individuals who were proponents of integrated education and multicultural education. We went to Washington, D.C., and we spoke with who was then the first U.S. Secretary of Education that had been appointed by President Carter. Her name was Dr. Shirley Hufstedler, and we presented to her what we regarded would be a very comprehensive introduction throughout all of America of truly multicultural, multi-ethnic education, reflecting the kinds of contributions that all Americans have made to the world of knowledge. We must admit that our textbooks, for the most part and throughout our history, have been generally Eurocentric in terms of those contributions. It's not to say that it's necessarily non-factual, but there were so many egregious omissions in terms of the content that those books reflected. We were given a promise that that administration under President Carter was going to fund, to the tune of about $3 million, a national effort in which was going to be participative 4 or 5 school systems across the country to truly have the textbooks examined and to make sure that the contributions made by African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and all other geocultural groups represented in our textbooks. However, there was a change in administration. And because that change of administrations did occur, when we went back to Washington about a year or so later, the promises made by the previous administration were in fact curtailed. Fortunately, however, when I came to Portland, I was thrilled to find that one of the leading groups in this community, who I feel have in fact done much to help the plight of black kids, I speak specifically the Black United Front, had in fact taken it upon themselves, along with other members of our school system, to see what they could do to bring this about in Portland. I joined with them, and they and I together, and my staff and others around the country, consisting of some of the major consultative assistants around this country, have in fact now concluded in writing what has been the first comprehensive set of African American baseline essays in the major disciplines of math, language arts, science, social studies, and the humanities, as well as music and art. And that is now a part of our curriculum. That's only the first stage of that. We still have more to do. We still believe that more must be done in terms of going beyond the black experience, but similarly including the kinds of contributions that Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans and American Indians and Pacific Islanders and all the other geoculture groups have made. This Board of Education has as one of its principal objectives making sure that within the next few years or so, we indeed become the model school system in this country. I do encourage you that if there are those of you who are interested in the kinds of content that we've succeeded in including there, let us know. We will certainly make that information available to you. But the idea is to have a truly factual, representative reflection of who has contributed what to the knowledge base of the world, rather than to say everything is automatically Eurocentrically derived.
Bob? Bob Shoemaker, member. We're all painfully aware, Dr. Prophet, that crime is, some say, out of control in our society, particularly among teenagers and young adults. We've built a host of prisons to pour them into, but we're beginning to realize that we'll never get there that way, and we really have to pay attention to kids during the very early years of their life, and to their parents who may not have much knowledge about how to be parents. I'm wondering if the Portland Public Schools are working on some kind of a Head Start program or something akin to that, in which you'll try to reach kids at age 3, 4, and their parents to help them become happy and productive citizens.
Very excellent question. And the answer is yes, we are. Some of the specifics are as follows. The Portland Board of Education believes that the difficulties that children face in the world begin at age 0 minus 9 months. We believe that even when our young teenage mothers in school and our students become pregnant, that the problem begins then. We believe that unless that young woman has the proper nourishment, unless she has the proper guidance, unless she understands the damage that can be done to the baby coming into the world by drugs and alcohol, unless she has, even when the baby is born, daycare, unless she has, and they have, the kids have, good health screening when they're 2, 3, 4 years old, because many of them don't have hospitalization or health plans. In other words, we believe that early childhood education, Head Start, begins at the moment of conception. Our schools, in fact, do have well-designed programs, even if they don't do it themselves, that are conducted in concert with other institutions, be they the Children's Services Division, the city, the county, who's primarily responsible for the health of our community, and others that really provide for a continuity or a continuum of services to all of our youngsters. Additionally, and I don't want to bring this out too far, we have a lot of formally organized programs that are generally also oriented toward preschool experiences. Those include some 7 early childhood educational centers that are operative primarily in Northeast Portland, another early childhood center that's at Ball School, other programs for 4- and 5-year-old kids who are prior to school age down in Southeast Portland, in programs such as the Piaget and the Montessori programs, and a variety of other programs such as Head Start, where we serve about 300 kids. While we're doing all of this, I don't want to leave the impression that we have necessarily reached nirvana, because even after having done this, we're probably only serving 30 to 40% of the young kids who need this service. And I would like all of you to do all that you can to remain very supportive of the many bills that are either in our state legislature or those that are in Washington that are directed toward really providing more comprehensive federal and state supportive services and fiscal support for early childhood education. It is very vital. There are all kinds of studies that have been done, and each one of them has concluded that it makes a big difference in what society's cost ultimately is for a child when, in fact, that child has been given the kinds of services I described. And so an investment now of $1 is estimated to save $20 later on. So yes, we're very deeply into it, but we have much, much more to do. As a matter of fact, next Saturday, our Board of Education has designated this as another thing we want to look at to see how much more we can do.
Red Look member. Dr. Prophet, in view of the expanded family responsibilities that our public schools have had to assume, shouldn't we be considering extending our school year at least to the 200 days from the 175 that we have now, and preferably, which is what they have in Vancouver, British Columbia, or at least, hopefully, to 220. Also, in view of the specialization of the family-type education we have to do, shouldn't we also be considering strengthening our teachers by targeting and rewarding the good teachers, and to the extent that it can either be abolished or modified, looking at tenure of bad teachers?
In both instances, the answer is yes. I do think that we should look at extending the school year. In fact, we have looked at that. As we look at it, we become very, very intimidated by the astronomical costs that are coincident with those particular postulates. We find difficult, as a matter of fact, of maintaining 175 days when you look at all those other complexities that we're talking about, okay? As a matter of fact, when you look at the comparisons made, and legitimately so, between the attainments and the academic achievements of our kids in America and compare them with kids from Europe, kids from Japan, one doesn't recognize that in Europe, kids go to school from 200 to 220 days. Kids in Japan go to school 240 days. So they're automatically, all things being equal, you certainly have a very noticeable discrepancy between the time on task. I think it would be a good idea. In fact, I would be a proponent for schools that would run as long as we can have them run, because the more time we spend on task with youngsters, the better they will perform. But I will say to you that the economics of that are indeed imposing. And as you know, we have very strong difficulty now even in sustaining the level of support that education is receiving. As a matter of fact, there's not enough money in Oregon now to support the 175 days that we've got. You only have to look at those districts that are out there, not quite as fortunate as ourselves, who are trying to survive, who are in the safety net. But Mr. Look, your point's well taken, and you're correct, and there's no question about that. We need to look at that, and I would hope in the future of the state, as our governor and some of the rest of us try to do our very, very best to plan for the next decade, that can be a target. Insofar as teachers are concerned, you again are correct. We have in the Portland schools what I regard and our board regards as a very outstanding cadre of teachers. We also have in our schools what we regard as being a very just manner of administering in a due process manner the idea of examining the effectiveness of teachers. We do our very, very best to do those things that are necessary for teachers to become more competent. We encounter the following kinds of challenges, however, when we try to make sure that we have 100% effectiveness in teaching. There are three very prominent mythologies that are perhaps associated with teachers in terms of their readiness to teach in school systems, and particularly in urban school systems, which are different than school systems in general because of the highly diversified confrontations that teachers come in contact with, as I described earlier. But the first myth is that universities somehow do in fact prepare teachers to teach. That's the myth. They do not. The second myth is that if the universities haven't done it, that superintendents and boards of education will somehow have all the wisdom and the knowledge necessary to impart to the teachers what they are lacking. That is also not necessarily true, because as a matter of fact, when you really look at the amount of attention and the amount of resources that we could dedicate to that, we in fact do not do it, and we can improve there. Thirdly, we believe that, or the myth is that, if the university has failed to do what they need to do, and if the institution itself of public education has failed, that somehow the teachers themselves will improve themselves. We know that's a myth, because in terms of our looking at what teachers really are attempting to do when they go to school and go back for matriculation at the university or go to special staff development activities, they go more often to find something else in which they're interested, to make some kind of a transfer from what they're doing, rather than actually to make themselves more competent in the area for which they have principal responsibility. So the answer is right. Your question is well put, and there's much improvement that we can have there. By the same token, I do not want to leave the impression that we do not have one fine, outstanding cadre of teachers. I commend our leadership of the professional organization of teachers in Portland, and I commend them in the sense, and I hope you realize this, I haven't talked about this a lot in my presentation, but we are one of the few school systems, urban school systems in the country, who has never been interrupted by horrible, harsh relationships between labor and management. I like that. I think that the kind of collegiality, cooperation that's been demonstrated between our teachers and ourselves to negotiate contracts and things have been really good for the community. This community could have really been exposed to some very highly deleterious activities that fortunately have not occurred. We're working on that, and there's a lot of progress we need to make, Mr. Look, in that area, and we'll continue to address it.
Kim Jeffries, City Club member. Dr. Prophet, one of the buzzwords in the governor's and the president's compact was international competitiveness. Some of the very successful systems, for instance, Japan and Korea, both make decisions fairly early on which students will be going on to secondary education and which students will be tracked into vocational and skill training. If one of the goals for the nation is international competitiveness, should we be rethinking our attitude towards vocational education?
I very definitely believe that we ought to, and I know you're saying I'm very redundant in terms of setting the things we're pursuing in the Portland schools to perhaps be an example, but let me give you a story that I think is very fitting to your question. In 1981, when my son, number 3, was in his 5th year of engineering school at General Motors Institute, and he was writing his thesis to get his diploma from that institution, he came to me one night and he said, Dad, could you have my thesis typed for me? I said, yes. And I read it over to see if I could understand it. And as I read it over, there were some things that I did not understand. And what I asked him, I say, what does this mean in this thesis? And he said, well, Dad, what that means is that you, as a superintendent of the Lansing School District, are doing nothing to really make sure that the kids in your school district are going to be prepared to function effectively in the decade of the 90s. He says it also says that the Oldsmobile plant here in Lansing now has 17,000 employees, and most of those employees are now performing tasks that for perennially, historically, have been performed as assembly, line, routine, mundane, step 1, 2, 3. He said that's all going to disappear. It says further, in 1987, of the 17,000 people on that assembly plant, there will be no need for 12,000 of them. He says, but it also says that although those 12,000 jobs will be eliminated, there's a geometric expansion of other opportunities and other pursuits and careers that are going to be created by virtue of the application of robotics and all the forms of technological advancements. And he said what it really says is that there needs to be a greater cooperative and collaborative relationship established between schools and education and public schools and business to make sure that we provide to those businesses people who are capable of doing those things. So your answer is yes. We think that vocational education is of eminent importance. We have a plan in the Portland schools which is called the Plan for the 90s, a plan which the Board of Education has approved to the tune of about $5 million, which in fact does identify the careers that are unfolding. And we have other plans, of course, that certainly will cause us to become more competitive when it comes to comparing what our youngsters do when we compare them with the results of youngsters who are taking tests internationally. Yes.
Pamela Reamer-Williams, member. I'm sure that most of us here understand why you decided not to accept the challenges offered to you by the Chicago and New York school districts. But frankly, many of us are puzzled as to why you turned down the position at Harvard. It sounded like a superb career move or a job opportunity, and we'd like to know why you turned it down.
The real reason is that in the Bay Area, which is only 610 miles to my kids' home, I have three youngsters to whom my wife and I are eternally in love with and dedicated, and we have the closest bond between those kids and ourselves as we've ever had in our lives. Our proximity to them and they to us, and the ease with which we can communicate with each other and see each other very, very frequently is more important to me as a family unit than any other career aspirations I would ever have. And I like the fact that that co-location is here.
Baumhofer, taxpayer.
We all are taxpayers, sir?
Pardon me?
You said taxpayer?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, yes, sir.
We all realize that as residents of a school district, we as citizens pay the funds to provide our public schools and our education for our youngsters. But from your perspective as the person responsible for the administration of our major school district in the state, does it matter to you if those funds come directly from the folks in your district, or if they come through the state process and are delivered through the collection of taxes that the state would levy?
The answer is yes, it does make a difference. From the theoretical perspectives of having looked at any number of structures of financing of education, I do not agree with school systems and or financial structures that cause the state to give more than 1/2 of the support to schools. The reason for that is as follows. I believe that the strength of American public education resides more in the ability of people, the local community, having the responsibility to pay for their own education, but then to be a part of determining what their kids need to know because they are there with them day to day. I would not be opposed to a formula, however, that would go 1/3, 33% for the state, 32% for the feds, and maybe 34% for ourselves. But I certainly want us to have more input in terms of the local tax dollars for the support of our youngsters than anyone else. I'm very fearful of the current proclivity toward wanting to nationally standardize every approach to education, of thinking that all of our kids are clones and can be produced through some kind of magical, mechanistic manner of educational pursuit. I believe that the people best able to make those decisions are, in fact, residents of our local communities, their parents, and our teachers here. For that reason, I would hope that any formula would never cause local taxpayers not to say, the schools are ours, and you know where the money comes from. Probably the control also should be associated with that.
Thank you.
Very short question, please.
Probably the most difficult.
It's a short question. Nancy Tang, member. Has consideration been given to tying the acquisition and retention of a driver's license for persons under 18 to continuation and completion of high school, as has been done in other states with significant improvement in the dropout rates?
To my knowledge, no, but it may be. My honest answer is that I do not know the answer to that. We do give, of course, all of our driver's examinations and our tests and instruction through the Portland Public School Police Department. I have read of what you describe as having tied those two things together, but as a matter of fact, I have not given any consideration to that as yet. I really have not. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prophet, again for taking the time and your thoughtful presentation. He did say that for those of you showing up next week, we'll have a pop quiz on the report card book. Please join us next week for Dwight Sangre, and don't forget to vote. Thank you.